What's the craziest double life you've ever personally seen revealed? Story 1. A counselor at my college in Michigan had faked his identity for over 40 years. He had been a civil rights organizer in San Francisco during the 1960s and ended up in a shootout with the police. None of the officers were injured, but he was apparently shot in the foot. He was supposed to appear in court later, but he took off, and in the more than 40 years following the shooting, he earned his master's degree under a whole new identity, ultimately working as a guidance counselor at a community college in Michigan. His true identity was exposed around the year 2010, and he went on trial for the shooting in California. He was sentenced to 1 year in jail and about $8,000 in fines. He was a nice guy, and you'd never expect someone who seemed so normal to actually be an old-school fugitive on the run. Story 2. There was this kid at our church who started attending the youth group when he was about 15. Everyone loved him, but he was always a little standoffish. Fast forward 3 years to graduation time. Everyone kept asking him what he planned to do after high school and if he was looking forward to it, but he always changed the subject. Finally, he revealed to one of the adults that he wasn't graduating because he hadn't been to school since he was 8 years old. His dad had removed him from school and never let him return. A whole bunch of things went down after that, but the church members helped him do a fast-track high school degree in 3 years and have now paid for him to attend a 4-year university. Story 3. My sister-in-law had a second child. She was still married but separated from her husband because she caught him cheating. The man with whom she had the baby was her father's old protege, who was also married with a couple of kids. This all took place in China, while the one-child policy was still in full effect. So, to her parents, the separation and affair were secret until she had the baby. Once they were looped in, they helped her maintain the lies because of saving face. From her ex-husband's perspective, the child and affair were secret. From the perspective of his family, with whom she remained in touch, the separation, affair, and baby were secret. This was complicated by the fact that they shared custody of their first child. They even pretended they were still living together for years. The older child was warned not to mention his brother to his father while spending plenty of time with both parents. It was all a secret from most, but not all, of their close family members like cousins, aunts, and uncles. And then there was the protege's family and the rest of the outside world, for whom there was no separation, no affair, and certainly no child. That included the government. I'm not even sure how that worked. She wasn't living another life. She was living fractals of lives within lives. Just imagine the logistics of getting your non-existent child to school under a false identity in time to pick up your older child, who was waiting with your secret lover so that he could get back to his real family, and you and your younger child could meet up with your cheating ex-husband to all drive together to lunch with family from both sides, doing your best impression of a perfect platonic family who had come straight from a shared loving home, while being careful that neither you nor your older boy mentioned that you had to pick up your other son from school soon. Now I've got a headache. Story 4. My uncle runs a business hooking up the internet in hotels. He travels all over the West Coast for it. Recently, he asked my aunt to have an open relationship. It turns out most of his business trips were actually trips to meet with his business partner, with whom he had been having an affair for the last year or two. This business partner had even had 2 pregnancies with my uncle. Both ended in miscarriages, but both were also intentional. My aunt and uncle have been married for 12 years and have a 5-year-old son. My aunt also has terminal cancer. He's been introducing their son to his mistress as his new mommy without my aunt's knowledge. Needless to say, that open relationship isn't happening. They're getting divorced. Story 5. Well, this is a pretty fitting question to stumble upon today. Here's a nutshell background. About 7 years ago, my brother was struggling with addiction, using almost anything and everything, though alcohol was his substance of choice. We have a long family history of alcohol use disorders. He dropped out of school and spent a few years bouncing around treatment centers and sober living houses. 3 years ago, he decided to move back, about 2 hours away from my parents' house, and get back into school. At this point, he was a lot older than the kids in his classes, and socializing was hard, so he would visit our parents every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. He decided to go for a chemistry degree every semester, talking about his specific classes, the content, and his professors. He knew the class times, the teaching styles, and like clockwork brought his dog to my parents' place twice a year during finals week so he could study without distraction. My entire family came from all across the country for his graduation ceremony on Friday. We were all bursting with pride and excitement because my brother had done what we thought was impossible and graduated. Before the ceremony, none of us could find his name in the program. Then we couldn't find him walking among the students. About 30 minutes into the ceremony, I got a call from him. He was drunk. Turns out he had never enrolled back into school. He just moved back, conned my parents into paying rent and utilities for 3 years, and spent 4 days a week drinking, gaming, and sleeping. No one had any idea this was going on. He invested so much into this double life that he had his whole family and all his friends fooled. We're not sure what the next steps are. My husband and I are going to help my parents pack up his place tomorrow. It's hard to find hope after this level of deceit. He's hurt so many people on this path, but he's my brother, and I love him nonetheless. Here's to a brighter tomorrow. Thanks for letting me get this out and process it a bit more. Story 6. When I first left home in my late teens, I shared a big house, probably 6 or more bedrooms, with a close friend, his brother, and some other random people. Think frat house, except without college. Splitting expenses worked out pretty well. One of the guys claimed to work at a port in customs or something. He had a uniform and an identification badge, left for work at the same time every morning, and hung out with us after work. He was always up for social events, and most of us liked him. Fast forward about a year, and he started telling us how he could get discounted televisions and other merchandise from the port unclaimed, or seized property that supposedly no one cared about if a few items went missing. Everyone turned it down since it seemed shady. Then one day we came home to find one of our housemates in shock, crying uncontrollably. Turns out, not only had he given this guy his life savings, but he had also borrowed money from his dad to give him. The customs guy had promised to get him a brand new car for cheap the long con. Turns out the guy didn't work at the port. The name he gave us didn't exist, and we had no idea how he spent his days or where he got his share of the rent and bills. It still creeps me out knowing I lived with a complete stranger for so long. Story 7. My family hosted a number of exchange students while we were growing up. We hosted about 7 high school students over the course of my childhood. Each stayed for a year in our house and attended high school in our town. One girl, Irina, from Russia, came to us no differently than any of the other students had, through the American Field Service program. To be a student through that program, you had to fill out an application, be 17 or 18 years old, and be attending high school in your home country. So Irina arrived as our exchange student. She went to high school in our small hometown on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. But at Christmas time, she said she had to go home to Russia because her mother was extremely sick. Going home during the exchange year was really unusual and rare. So fine, she was going to Russia for the Christmas break and would be back in January. Except she never came back. The program couldn't find her. We didn't know where she was, if she had made it to Russia, or if she was hurt. We were terrified because we were her host family, and we always treated our students like family. Anyway, she was gone. Maybe 3 months later, my mom was driving through our tiny town in the middle of nowhere on Cape Cod and saw Irina with what looked like her mom and some other kids. It turned out Irina had already graduated high school in Russia, was about 25 years old with children, and had posed as an exchange student so she could scout the area before bringing the rest of her family. Story 8. I worked with this guy once who was known for his stories. No matter how loose the connection was, he'd find a way to turn anything into a personal anecdote about something he'd supposedly seen or done. All of them were interesting at first. He'd lived what seemed like an exciting life, growing up in America, moving to Australia in his early 20s, and working in a lot of cool places over the years. But it wasn't long before he started repeating the same stories over and over again. I worked with him for just over 3 years, so it got pretty ridiculous. We knew how he met his wife, all the obscure things he owned, his pets, his kids. We knew every detail of his life. It became a running joke in the office that he never stopped talking. Then one day he didn't come in. He had died of a heart attack. The whole office was shocked, especially our small department of about 8 people, including him. When it came to his funeral, Our group took the afternoon off to attend. That's when we found out that none of his stories were true. He had grown up locally, his family wasn't who we thought they were, and none of his old jobs had ever happened. Everything we thought we knew about him was made up. The most interesting part for me was that at one point, our boss needed someone to go to China to double-check something in person at one of our company's factories. When the usual choices couldn't do it, he was picked. It seemed like a no-brainer since he always talked about traveling back and forth to America and all the international work he had done. We now think that may have been his very first time overseas. Story 9. My grandmother passed away a couple of years ago. While going through her house, my family found a box with my grandfather's name written on it in his handwriting. My grandfather had died before I was born. The box was taped shut, and the thick layer of dust suggested it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside, my family found newspaper clippings and other documents. It turned out that in the early 1900s, my grandfather took a road trip with friends to see the ocean. During their time at the beach, their car was stolen. Since they were in their late teens and out of school, they decided to stay a while, earn some money, and have fun. My grandfather met a Mexican girl and married her within a month. There was an article about the vehicle theft, another about the marriage, and even a marriage certificate. We could never find information about what happened afterward. We don't know if they married for love, for citizenship, if they had kids, or even if he was legally divorced when he later married my grandmother in the 1930s. We don't think my grandmother ever knew. We did find out that his first wife eventually returned to Mexico. She did have children who say they don't believe their mother had kids before she remarried. We sent them copies of the documents we found, and they were just as shocked as we were. Story 10. There was one dad in our mother's group who lost his high-flying, big-city financial job during a market crash. To pay the bills, and because there were no jobs in finance at the time, he took the first job he could find, working in a chicken slaughterhouse. It was quite a change from a desk job to butchering chickens. But when you have a newborn baby and bills to pay, you do what you must. It sounds odd, but our group was made up of new moms who met weekly to swap stories about newborns, and sometimes there would be a barbecue or gathering where the dads would come too. Every time I ran into him, I was always impressed with how up-to-date he was on current events and world news. We would talk about politics, finance, and science. There was never much discussion about chickens. It turned out he had been fired on his very first day. Every day after that, for months, he would leave home in the morning, go to the pub, read newspapers all day, and then go home in the evening, pretending he still had a job. Eventually, his wife found out. They are divorced now. Story 11. My brother was married to the same woman for 21 years. Around year 19, it became clear that my sister-in-law wasn't happy and was planning to leave him until my brother was diagnosed with cancer. She decided to stay through his chemotherapy and surgeries, but everyone knew she was going to move on eventually. One day while my brother was home and my sister-in-law was at the gym, the Special Weapons and Tactics team broke down the door, threw my brother to the ground, handcuffed him, and held him at gunpoint. They were looking for her, to arrest her for child exploitation, abuse, and endangering children. They eventually arrested her at the gym while my brother was being detained at the house. Skipping some of the grim details, it turned out that she had been having multiple affairs and was now serving 25 years in state prison after confessing to those crimes. We also learned that she had been involved in disturbing acts with the family dog, with photo evidence found on her personal computer. She had been the daughter-in-law my mother always wished for, and no one knew she had been living such a horrifying double life for the last 2 years before going to prison. Story 12. I served in the Navy from 1985 to 2005. While in my first squadron, from 1985 to 1989, we were away from home often, either on short detachments lasting 2 to 5 weeks or 6-month deployments. During one period when we were home for a while, I was on watch in the duty office after hours. Another guy and I just had to man the office, answer the phone, and monitor the guys on watch down in the hangar bay. Shortly after our watch started, we got a phone call from a wife of someone in our squadron. She was asking when the squadron would be back from detachment. I asked the other guy if he knew about anybody out on detachment, and he just looked at me funny. I told her we didn't currently have anyone out. We'd all been home for a couple of months. She insisted her husband had been out on detachment for 3 weeks and needed to know when he was coming home. I assured her nobody was out and told her I had seen her husband earlier that day at work. She hung up after that. It turned out the guy had been telling his wife he was away on detachment while actually shacking up with his girlfriend for a few weeks. She later called the commanding officer to find out when her husband had been deployed and discovered he'd done it many times over the previous couple of years. Infidelity is officially against the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It did not end well for him. Story 13. A fellow graduate student I know has 2 young kids, one of whom is struggling to walk and communicate and is in the process of being diagnosed. She's pulling 10 to 16-hour days between interning and classes, plus being a mom and wife. One day she got a call from a friend who said she was excited to see her at her husband's work party. What? She hadn't RSVP'd, and her husband had told her he would only stop by the party for less than an hour before coming home for a quiet dinner together. It turned out he was bringing a date who wasn't her. They had been seeing each other for about 6 months and had even taken a trip together under the pretense of a business trip. Anytime he'd been late or away, he was probably with her. The friend did her a huge favor and took a few pictures for the divorce lawyer. Story 14. Not exactly a double life, but my cousin was a secret for 4 years. When my uncle was 21, he and his girlfriend had a baby without telling anyone in our large, very nosy family. No one suspected a thing, and they continued dating. When I was 8 and their daughter was 4, her adoptive parents were killed in a fire and left in their will that they wanted her to go back to her biological parents. My uncle and his girlfriend sincerely regretted giving their daughter up, so they were thrilled to have her back. Everyone just accepted the fact that they had essentially kept a secret child for 4 years and were oddly okay with it. My cousin is 14 now and has 2 full siblings. My aunt and uncle are great parents, and every now and then, someone brings up the situation, but it's mostly just laughed off. I still find it a little strange, though. Story 15. My ex-wife got fired from 2 jobs within 9 months. She finally got a job at Hank's Furniture. After a couple of months, she told me she had to work 3 days a week at one of their locations, about 2 hours away. That quickly turned into 5 days a week. She told me in this role she didn't get paid until after the furniture was delivered, so it took time to get paid. She started staying overnight there with her boss, a woman. It seemed fishy, but I looked up the woman, and she was indeed the store manager at that location, so I let it go. The money still wasn't coming in. I had 2 kids and a full-time job. I had to constantly borrow money from my in-laws and my parents to make ends meet, and my ex-wife was never around. I had foolishly put her in charge of most of our finances, so I didn't see her max out our credit card. When I realized she hadn't been paid after a month, I told her she had to quit and come home to find a job nearby. She was furious but said she knew she'd be paid the next day. Sure enough, $3,600 showed up in the account. A few weeks later, I told her again to come home, and this time she reluctantly did. While at home, she took our daughter up to that store one Saturday to collect something she'd left behind. She took a picture of herself and our 5-year-old at the Hanks location. She went back one more time to collect a paycheck in person and deposited about $2,450. Then out of nowhere, I saw a very expensive lunch charge on our bank statement, over $50 at a restaurant. I was upset and decided to call the store, asking for the woman manager she had supposedly been working with and staying with. When I got her on the phone, I said, "Hi, this is the husband of your employee. Did you have lunch with her on Monday?" The woman replied, "Who?" I said my wife's name and explained she had worked and stayed with her for the last few months. The woman said, "I don't know that person, and she never worked for me or stayed with me." A pit formed in my stomach. I was distraught and furious. I had to know for sure. I went to the Hanks store in my town and learned she had been fired months ago and was never transferred to another location. I was in panic mode. I hired a lawyer and filed for divorce. I discovered the maxed out credit card and later realized the 2 large paychecks were actually from same-day loan places with absurd interest rates. When I served her with divorce papers, she trashed my house in a fit of rage. She had been staying with her ex-boyfriend from high school, likely for and substances. She went to extreme lengths to prolong her lies and made me feel like a fool. The good news is she didn't show up for the hearing, and I got full custody. After a year of visitation at my discretion, she later took me to court for scheduled visitation, but hadn't even been consistent with the visits I'd already allowed. She didn't show up to that hearing either, though it cost me $1,000. Eventually, I remarried the love of my life. After a year, we filed to let her adopt my older two kids. I had 58 pages of documentation proving my ex didn't pay child support or show up for visitation. We won, and the judge said all the harsh words I'd always wanted to say to her right there in the courtroom. Closure is a great feeling, and my kids no longer suffer from a mother who never showed up. Story 16. A guy I used to work with lived in a small country town with his wife and 3 kids. When he was fired from his job where I worked, the only position he could find at his level was in a big city 2 hours away. So he would go to work in the city Monday through Friday and come home to his wife and kids on the weekends. This went on for years. About 5 years into this arrangement, it came out that he wasn't actually living in the small, rundown city apartment he said he was. Instead, he was living with his girlfriend and their 2 kids. So he had a wife and 3 kids, plus a girlfriend and 2 kids, all his. Apparently, the girlfriend knew about the wife, but the wife had no idea about the girlfriend. His 3 country kids had 2 younger siblings they didn't even know existed. Naturally, it all blew up spectacularly. The wife kicked him out, and he went to live with the girlfriend. 6 months later, she got tired of him and kicked him out too. Now he pays child support for 5 kids to 2 different women and is actually living in that tiny, crappy apartment for real this time. Story 17. Not sure if this counts as a double life exactly, but my mom was a total sociopath. She got away with presenting herself as this free-spirited, self-sacrificing hippie mom who would do anything for her kids until I was about 23. That's when I found out she was stealing my identity, forging my checks, and that my sister and I realized my dad, who had recently divorced her, wasn't lying when he said she'd run up massive credit card debt, cashed out his retirement account, filed false tax returns to cover it up, and even let 19-year-old boys live with us under the excuse that they'd had falling outs with their parents. They were actually substance dealers, and she was sleeping with them. So not exactly a double life, more like a non-stop spree of lying and manipulation. She did a lot more insane stuff, but it would take forever to explain. I cut her out of my life a decade ago. It was rough for a while, but everything's good now. Story 18. When my dad married my stepmom, my biological mom had died young from cancer. She was warm and proud to welcome me and my 2 siblings into her family with her 2 sons. For a while, things went well. She seemed genuinely devoted to making a home out of the fixer-upper she and Dad bought in a nice neighborhood. They had an active social life, joined the yacht club since Dad's 20-foot sailboat qualified, and rubbed shoulders with the mayor, his wife, and a few local celebrities. Her only odd quirk was that she changed her self-employed career every month. Clothing designer, painter, decorator, importer, you name it. She had no qualifications but somehow managed to land contracts to redecorate apartment lobbies or repaint car dealerships. Then things started going downhill between her and Dad. She was impatient to climb the social and financial ladders, while Dad was careful with money. Their fights got louder and more frequent. Finally, one tragic night after a huge argument, she died in an accident. What was discovered afterward was shocking. For years, she had been keeping a downtown apartment for daytime affairs with men she thought could give her what Dad wouldn't: money. The apartment had a king-size bed with a mirrored ceiling and other details too explicit to describe. She even had an ongoing affair with Dad's employer, a wealthy married man whose wife we had considered one of her best friends. The sources of her various business contracts became clear. Her clients were men she was sleeping with. Those expensive refurbishing jobs had little to do with skill and everything to do with manipulation. But to our neighbors and friends, it just looked like the tragic death of a devoted wife and mother. Story 19. This story has haunted me for years. A few years back, I started a business with a woman friend. We traveled a lot together and got close, and eventually she started revealing parts of her past that left me completely stunned. She was Canadian and had taken a job as a bank teller after college. Bored with her life and wanting to move to the United States, she embezzled money from the bank, fled the country, and changed her name. She started fresh, making friends, drinking, using substances, and living wildly. During a rock concert campout, she shaved her head, just like Britney Spears, something rare for women in the mid-'80s. Shortly after, she met a man who asked about her shaved head, and she told him she was undergoing cancer treatment. Somehow that lie became her new identity. He fell for her, stood by her, and even attended cancer support groups. His family adored her, believing she was a sweet young woman bravely battling illness. They got married and she tried to turn her life around, even entering what she told him was a cancer treatment center, but it was actually rehab. They went on to be married for 20 years and had a daughter. Her husband and his family believed she was a good Mormon girl from Utah who had survived cancer. She never told them she was Canadian, in the U.S. illegally, or a fugitive embezzler. Years later, she was caught, and her husband learned everything. Somehow they stayed married, though his family never found out. Their daughter never knew the truth either. She told me all this about 10 years after being caught. We had been business partners for about 9 months when I noticed our account was suddenly overdrawn. When I asked her about it, I found out she had drained $50,000 from our business for a long weekend in Las Vegas. She hadn't planned to tell me. I was stunned. As a partner, she had full access to the funds, so it wasn't technically theft, but it destroyed me. This woman I thought had changed, someone I'd come to see as a calm, suburban mom who'd reformed from a bad past, had fooled me completely. 3 days later, she was found dead from a hero overdose in an empty trailer in a parking lot in Stockton, California. No one knew why she was there or how she ended up that way. After her death, more secrets came out: hidden apartments, secret bank accounts, and massive debts. Her husband and daughter said it was the best thing that could have happened because she'd been destroying everything around her. Real life can be far darker and stranger than any story ever written. Story 20. My mom had power of attorney over some clients' properties, and we had to have them appraised for legal procedures. I went with the appraiser to one of the apartments, which had been rented for years by a man who always paid on time. He was a nice professional guy. I only knew him because his checks always arrived like clockwork. He was also a lawyer, lived in a nice neighborhood, and I was pretty sure I knew his daughters. He greeted me and the appraiser, looking a bit nervous, and opened the door for us. The moment we walked in, I realized why I'd been asked to oversee this appraisal. He had turned that apartment into a full-on S-dungeon. That's when it clicked. My mom must have known and delegated this one to me on purpose. It turned out this guy had been living a double life for about 10 years, maintaining a mistress and a second family that apparently only my mom, her client, and I knew about. He even had a daughter with his mistress, and she had a lovely Disney princess bedroom right next to a love nest equipped with mirrors on the ceiling, special furniture, whips, and scented candles. I was 21 at the time and handled it professionally, but honestly, it was hilarious. The things you see on the job. Story 21. I knew a girl from the United Arab Emirates who came to Canada for university. Her parents were loaded. They owned a $5 million house back home, and she lived in a luxury apartment right in downtown Toronto. She had a massive allowance and a credit card for whatever she wanted. Her mother wore a burqa, and her entire family was very religious and conservative. But the double life. She was a hardcore raver and party girl who was almost never sober and was in an open relationship with a transgender woman. Her apartment was an absolute disaster: ketamine-covered mirrors, substance baggies scattered everywhere, takeout boxes, and clothes piled up so high you could barely see the floor. She was a royal mess by any country's standards. If her parents knew even a fraction of what was going on, she would have been in serious trouble. I remember seeing her a couple of times before her parents came to visit. She was frantic, rocking back and forth with powder on her face, repeating, "Gotta call Mary Maid, gotta call Mary Maid," which was a cleaning service for party houses. The day before her parents arrived, the place was spotless. You could eat off any surface. Her rave gear was hidden at her girlfriend's. Her fridge was stocked with normal food, and she was sober, bright-eyed, and perfectly put together. Story 22. I worked at Victoria's Secret for several years and saw a lot of shady stuff, but the worst incident happened during the holiday season. A man came in and bought some lingerie along with a set of cozy flannel pajamas. He asked for the items to be bagged separately with separate gift receipts. Simple enough, so I let the new cashier I was training handle it while I went to assign breaks. A few days later, the same guy came storming back in, absolutely furious, screaming and cursing everyone out. Turns out, the new cashier had mixed up the gift receipts. His wife got the lingerie and found out about his mistress. There was no fixing that. The guy was a jerk anyway, so I just called security and went on with my day. To answer the inevitable questions, we always asked if customers needed gift receipts during the holidays. Most men shopping there were panicked and just wanted to get out fast, so he probably didn't pay attention. The packages were gift wrapped, so he likely never checked before handing them out. Yes, he came in yelling that we'd ruined his marriage, claiming the store should have better standards for anonymity and demanding someone be fired. One can only imagine how that went down at home. The poor cashier didn't do it on purpose. She cried through her entire break, but honestly, she did that wife a favor. Oh, and fun fact, my husband was in the other room on Reddit when he stumbled upon the original post about this. Story 23. Not really a secret because it was always out in the open, but my parents' friend has the strangest double life I've ever seen. Paul was married to Clarissa for 12 years, and they had a son together. After they broke up, Paul moved out and started dating a woman named Jenny. Not long after, Jenny got pregnant, and that's when Paul realized he missed Clarissa. Somehow, he managed to convince both Jenny and Clarissa to share him. A few years later, he even added another woman named Renee to the mix. To be clear, these were all decent-looking, professional women, and Paul was no rich or charming playboy. He had a wife and 2 girlfriends, each living in their own house on the same street, each with their own separate family life. Paul spent one night with each woman in rotation, and they even traded holidays. The women weren't involved with each other and barely interacted, so it wasn't some kind of polyamorous setup or sister-wife arrangement. How he managed to pull that off and keep the peace is beyond me, but somehow it's been working for years. Story 24, I have 2 wild ones. First, my aunt dated a guy named Joe, a minor league baseball player who was charming, handsome, and well-liked by the whole family except for my grandma. She always said he seemed like a closeted fellow, her polite way of saying she thought he liked men. Turns out she was right. My aunt got suspicious and started following him. One night she caught him dressing in drag and going to gay clubs. The second story involves my friend's girlfriend, who worked as an adult caregiver. When they first started dating, she lived with one of her clients, but later she moved in with my friend and began seeing multiple clients throughout the week. They got serious, decided to save up for a wedding and a house, and both took on extra work. He was grinding 70-hour weeks between his main job and a side gig, while she worked evenings cleaning houses. After about a year, he developed painful sores and went to a clinic where he found out he had herpes. Turns out she'd been sleeping with guys from her cleaning job, including one she'd been seeing regularly. She'd been with my friend for almost 6 years. The breakup was ugly, he got most of the savings, and she ended up with herpes and her side boyfriend. It messed him up for a while, but he eventually recovered. Years later, we ran into her at a grocery store, and she looked rough, inspecting bananas like life had completely beaten her down. Story 25. On my grandmother's 85th birthday, we threw a big party. The whole family was there, and since it was northern Mexico, the invitation rules were pretty loose. I was 17 at the time, as were most of my cousins. One of them, Gerardo, didn't have a girlfriend then, so he brought a friend named Oscar. They'd been hanging out for about 4 years, but this was Oscar's first time meeting the family. When they arrived, one of the older cousins was going around the parking lot collecting money from everyone to buy booze. Gerardo said he'd ask his dad for some money, and Oscar went with him. A few minutes later, Oscar ran back out looking pale and shocked. He said he'd just seen his father inside the man he'd only met twice in his life. Gerardo asked who it was, so they went back in, and Oscar pointed to the man. It turned out my uncle was also Oscar's father. That night, Oscar met his entire extended family for the first time, and we all discovered we had a cousin we'd never known existed. Story 26. When I was a senior in college, I interned at a large engineering firm. I was studying electrical engineering, splitting my time between the electrical department and the IT support team. The head of IT was very forward with me and the other young guys in the office. But I managed to avoid her attention because my girlfriend often came by for lunch, which helped keep things professional. One of my coworkers wasn't so lucky. He went out drinking with some people from the office and she showed up. They hooked up a bad idea, but no one could have guessed how bad. About a week later, flyers appeared all over his neighborhood in our office building calling him a sexual predator and a rapist. The details on the flyers made it clear she had done it. He went straight to management and an investigation began. Both were placed on leave and the firm hired a private investigator. Within a week, the investigator discovered that the IT manager wasn't who she claimed to be. She had stolen her identity from a dead woman. The college she claimed to have attended didn't even exist. She had chemically removed her fingerprints with acid and refused to give a DNA sample. She was immediately fired and the police were notified, but she disappeared. The address on file didn't exist and no one knew where her mail went. The thing is, she was brilliant and highly skilled in multiple systems, so no one had ever doubted her education or background. That experience was 20 years ago, and it left a lasting mark on me both personally and professionally. Story 27. A manager at a Jimmy John's I worked at in Cincinnati seemed like the most reliable guy you could meet. He was quiet, kept to himself, always showed up on time, and did a great job. I was still in school, so I didn't work every shift. But whenever we worked together, he was solid. He said he was taking online business courses at the University of Cincinnati, which made sense since our shop was right across the street from campus. Then one day, he didn't show up for work. No one could reach him. And when someone checked his address, no one answered. We figured he'd just quit and moved on with life. Then one night after closing around 3 a.m, a man knocked on the door. My coworker ignored him, thinking he was just a drunk student. But then he held up a badge Homeland Security. Turns out our missing manager was actually a cyber criminal who'd been using his job and fake college enrollment as cover while stealing money from elderly people. None of us had any clue. Story 28. I used to work the front desk in an emergency room. One day, paramedics brought in a man after a car accident. A short while later, a woman came to the desk saying, "My husband was in a car wreck. He's here." I checked, confirmed he could have visitors, and let her back. About 20 minutes later, another woman came up and said the exact same thing. "My husband is here. He's been in a car accident." I knew we only had one crash patient that day. I asked for his name, same guy. Now, I'm not one to judge people's relationships. I'm poly myself and know plenty of folks who call each other husband and wife in unconventional arrangements. So I just did my job. I called the unit, asked if she could visit, got the okay, and let her in. What happened next was chaos. This man wasn't polyamorous. He was living 2 entirely separate lives, with 2 wives, 2 homes, and 2 sets of children. Neither woman had any idea the other existed until that moment. Let's just say there was a mild kerfuffle. In the end, both women walked out together, united in fury, already planning their divorces. It still amazes me that this man's double life came crashing down over a minor fender bender that wasn't even his fault. He looked absolutely haunted walking out of that hospital. Story 29. My ex-stepfather was a well-off pilot for a local medical helicopter service. He had 3 daughters who adored him, and he was always kind to me and my sister. He was one of the most polite, soft-spoken men I'd ever met and worshipped the ground my mom walked on. But behind closed doors, he had blackout rage issues. After a year of marriage, he gave my mother a concussion and broke her leg in 3 places. At the time, I was told she had slipped and fallen. It wasn't until years later, long after they split, that I learned the truth. My mom was smart enough to leave him quickly, and even smarter not to tell me back then. I was, and still am, much bigger than he is, and I would have gone after him. I saw him once after that. He tried to make small talk, acting like everything was fine. I told him I knew everything, and if we hadn't been in the hospital where my girlfriend worked, I probably would have tried to end him. We haven't spoken since. Story 30. When I was 20, my friends and I used to party with this guy named Bob. He was in his early 30s and dating a girl we'd gone to high school with. Bob was a stand-up guy, or so we thought. Once we were dealing with a sketchy man who claimed he'd rent us his house while he was on military deployment. Bob started questioning him about his background and quickly figured out the guy wasn't in the military at all, just some wannabe liar. That really angered Bob since he was in the Army Reserves. We had seen him off at the bus station plenty of times for his weekend drills and 2-week trainings, so we all believed him. We were close, some of my friends even rented a house with him. One day Bob asked to talk privately. He told me his restaurant job had cut his hours and he was short on rent, so he asked to borrow $200. I didn't hesitate. After all, he just landed another job and we all trusted him. A week later, my friends hadn't seen Bob or their rent money. Around the same time, another friend couldn't find his girlfriend. After some digging, we realized we'd been completely fooled. Bob had asked all of us for money, then vanished. His ex, the girl from our high school, finally confessed that Bob had never been in the military, had a recurring coca addiction, and had run off to Virginia with my buddy Jim's girlfriend. Bob still owes me money, but honestly, he was a fun guy to hang out with until he wasn't. Story 31. Back when I was waitressing, we had this regular who always told long stories about her family. One day after being gone for a few months, she came back with one that blew my mind. Her family was very patriotic military through and through. Her grandfather had fought in World War II, and all her uncles and cousins had served. When her grandmother passed away, she helped her mom clean out the old house. In the attic, she found a box of smaller boxes, each containing a telegram that began with, "We regret to inform you," along with personal effects from different soldiers. It was odd because her grandfather had obviously survived the war, but the names didn't match. After opening several, she realized her grandmother, who had lived near a military training base, had secretly married somewhere between 6 and 15 young soldiers heading to war men who later died overseas. Each time she'd received the telegram and kept everything. The last soldier survived, and that was the man who became her grandfather. They were married 60 years and had 6 children. None of their kids or grandkids had any idea about her grandmother's past until that discovery. Story 32. My partner and I were on duty one night when we got dispatched to a welfare check for a missing person. A woman had reported her husband missing, saying he was supposed to be on a business trip but hadn't called or emailed. She used OnStar to locate his car, which was parked at a house out in the rural part of our area. We drove out around 4 in the morning and knocked on the door. An older man answered and identified himself as the homeowner. He said the car belonged to his new son-in-law, a man he called Lord Bottomtooth, who was staying in the back house with his daughter. When we asked him to describe the man, his description matched perfectly, including a British accent, but the name didn't line up. We walked to the back house and knocked. A young woman answered, and when we asked to speak with Lord Bottomtooth, a man came to the door. My partner called him Hugh, and he instinctively responded before trying to slam the door on us. My partner doesn't tolerate liars, so he loudly told Hugh that his wife had reported him missing and that she and their children were worried sick. Hugh tried to play dumb, but after some pressure, he admitted he'd created a fake identity, married a new woman, and planned to abandon his old life entirely. We called his first wife on speaker to confirm he was alive. Meanwhile, I spoke to his second wife, who said they had been married a little over a year and were planning to move to Florida into a house her parents had bought for them. When I explained that her new husband was already married, had 2 kids, and owned a home with his first wife, she was furious. Both women, once they spoke, were equally enraged. Wife number 1 cursed him out. Wife number 2 sicked her father on him. And Hugh gathered his things and drove off, watching both his lives implode. The bonus? My partner, still angry, double-checked the laws and discovered that bigamy was indeed a criminal offense in our state. So we filed charges, potentially jeopardizing Hugh's residency status. Story 33. My great-grandfather served in the Navy during World War II. While out at sea, his ship was bombarded and heavily damaged. He suffered serious injuries, slipped into a coma, and was eventually transferred to a Navy hospital in California for recovery. Months later, when he finally woke up, he was weak and confused, but alive. During his time at the hospital, he met a Navy nurse who took care of him during his rehabilitation. Over time, they fell deeply in love, and once he was discharged, they married. That nurse became my great-grandmother. For decades, our family cherished their story as a beautiful wartime romance. 2 people brought together by fate and healing after tragedy. My grandmother, their daughter, used to tell the story with pride, describing how their love had blossomed amid the chaos of war. But a few years ago, my grandmother casually added a shocking new detail that no one had ever heard before. She told me that when she was a teenager, a Mexican woman showed up at their home after years of searching for my great-grandfather. She claimed she was his real wife. According to her, before the war, my great-grandfather had married her and even had children with her. But after his ship was bombed and he fell into a coma, he lost his memory and never reached out again. When he woke up, he didn't remember his first family at all. Not his wife, not his kids, not even his home. So he built a new life with the nurse who became my great-grandmother. My grandmother said that the woman had proof of their marriage, even photos and documents, and that she was devastated to find him remarried and living a completely different life. My great-grandfather chose to stay with his new wife and never reconnected with his first family. My grandmother mentioned this story only once, and I've never been able to confirm it, but if it's true, it means my family's great romantic story was built on the loss and erasure of an entire other life he left behind. Story 34. My stepmother has a cottage up north in Canada, and I've been going there with my family since I was 8 or 9 years old. Her family had owned the property for decades, and over time they became very close to the neighbors. The man who owned the neighboring cottage, Jim, was a retired high school teacher. He lived there with his second wife, Susan, and both of them were incredibly warm, funny, and generous people. They quickly became like family, the kind of neighbors who would invite everyone over for pizza, music, and stories by the fire. Jim was especially charismatic. He could play a 12-string guitar like a professional, told endless jokes, and was always the life of the party. He had built a large outdoor pizza oven out of stone and would host big gatherings for all the nearby cottages during summer weekends. To me, Jim and Susan were my cottage grandparents, and every year, our trips up north felt incomplete without them. Then last summer came, and something felt off. For the first time since I could remember, Jim and Susan weren't there. Their cottage sat empty, and my stepmother's family said they hadn't seen them in months. Later, my parents sat me down and told me something that completely shattered my perception of the man I had admired for so long. Jim had been arrested for multiple charges related to child exploitation. I won't go into the awful details, but it involved the possession and distribution of illegal material. I couldn't believe it. The kind, musical, neighborly man I had looked up to was living a dark and disgusting double life. He was released on bail and, shockingly, went to live with his ex-wife until his trial. He ended up being sentenced to a year in prison. Hearing the news felt like a gut punch. Every memory I had of him, his laughter, the songs, the pizzas, felt corrupted. It was like realizing someone you loved was just a mask hiding something monstrous. I still struggle to reconcile the person I knew with the crimes he committed. Story 35. My uncle was one of those men who seemed very westernized compared to others from our conservative Islamic background. He lived in London, wore modern clothes, spoke perfect English, and had a wide circle of British friends. He often took my cousin, his son, on holidays with his close white friend. I used to be jealous of those trips because they always looked like the kind of fun family vacations I never got to have with my own dad. His friend was always around too, a polite, charming man who was genuinely interested in our culture. Everyone in the family liked him and thought he was just a great, open-minded friend who bonded with my uncle over their mutual respect for different traditions. Sadly, my uncle died of cancer in the 1990s. I remember the family mourning deeply. Everyone loved him. Years later, after I got married, my wife and I were talking about taking a trip abroad, and I mentioned how my uncle used to travel with his friend. That's when she casually dropped a truth I wasn't ready for. She said, "You do know your uncle was gay, right? That white guy wasn't just his friend, he was his boyfriend. They used to take your cousin along on holidays so it would look like a normal family trip." I was speechless. Suddenly, everything started making sense. The years my uncle lived apart from his wife before she joined him in London, the unusually close relationship with his friend, and the way his friend appeared in almost every photo, always at his side. Looking back at old pictures, it was obvious. The man's body language, the subtle affection, the way my uncle looked at him. It was a quiet truth that everyone in the family must have suspected, but never spoke aloud, especially back then, when it would have been dangerous to do so. I've never mentioned it to my cousin, It wouldn't be right to taint his father's memory with something that changes nothing about who he was. My uncle was kind, caring, and brave enough to live as he wanted, even in secret. It's sad that he had to hide such a big part of his life, but I respect him even more knowing what he must have gone through just to find love and happiness in his own way. Story 36. There's only so much I can say without giving too much away, but when I was in high school, there was a classmate who suddenly disappeared one day. No one knew what had happened. Rumors spread that he was dead, in jail, or murdered. Everyone knew he'd been mixed up in a serious substance ring, but no one talked about it openly. Then about a year later, the whole thing blew up. The ring got busted, a lot of people were arrested, and some were hurt or worse in the fallout. It wasn't just a few kids selling weed. It was a real operation. Some of it even made the news. Fast forward about 4 years and I'm in another state, far from home, grabbing food at a fast food place when I spot him. My jaw dropped. I walked over and said, "Hey man, you're alive." He froze, his face went pale, and he immediately told me not to tell anyone I'd seen him. He said if anyone found out where he was, it'd be a race between the people he'd ratted out and the U.S. Marshals to get to him first. That's when I realized he had flipped on the substance ring and gone into witness protection. I've never seen anyone look so genuinely terrified. He was shaking, staring at the door every few seconds. It was the kind of fear you can't fake. The kind that comes from knowing one wrong move could literally get you killed. Story 37. My ex-boyfriend and I were together for a couple of years, and then he moved up north for work. Since we're in the UK, it wasn't that far away, so we saw each other every other weekend. The plan was for him to finish his PhD, and then one of us would move so we could finally live together. During the week, he said he was too busy with his job and studies to see me, which sounded fair. Turns out I was completely wrong. He had another girlfriend in another northern city, and the weekends he wasn't with me, he was with her. I only found out because, by pure coincidence, she showed up one weekend to surprise him while I was there. He was out for a run, and she and I started talking. When he walked in and saw us both, his face said it all. I told him exactly where to go, grabbed my things, and left. She and I actually stayed in touch afterward, comparing notes. It was wild. He acted like two totally different men. With me, he was intellectual, bookish, and into media and literature. With her, he was this macho, sports-loving lad. We realized how carefully he'd maintained the two roles. He'd tell me he was taking photos for me, but he was really cropping her out of them. He'd text me nonstop while she was building his furniture. He spent my birthday weekend with me and made her wait at his flat for 3 days. I told everyone in his life what he'd done. His friends, his department, even his brother. Now he's completely alone, which frankly is exactly what he deserves. Story 38. When my parents divorced when I was 8, my mom started dating a man named Lee about a year later. He worked with her, was kind, dependable, and quickly became part of our family. He showed up for every school play, helped us move, and treated my brother and me like his own kids. Over the years, he became like a second father to me. For almost a decade, he and my mom were inseparable. But by my senior year of high school, things started to fall apart. They fought constantly, especially when people started asking why, after nearly 10 years together, they weren't married. He had no social media, kept his own house an hour away, and never introduced my mom to his family. He said he just wasn't ready for that step, but wanted to start looking at houses and engagement rings soon. My mom believed him. Then everything exploded. One evening, my mom got a call from a coworker who said she needed to talk about Lee. That night, the woman told my mom the truth. Lee had been living a double life for nearly 10 years. He was married and had 2 children, one 5 years old and one just a few months old. I'll never forget my mom's face when she told us. All those nights we thought he was working late or visiting family. He was really at home with his wife and kids. He would spend the nights at our house when my brother and I stayed with our dad, then go back to his real family the rest of the time. He'd given us gifts, memories, even love, yet it had all been a lie. My mom's heart broke, but she blamed herself, even though none of it was her fault. Later, his sister reached out to us. She was horrified. She said she had no idea he'd been doing this. When she came to our house and we told her everything, She actually threw up in our kitchen. His wife, on the other hand, refused to believe it. He told her that my mom had been an old affair he'd had twice years ago, and that my brother and I weren't his kids. He said my mom was lying. We gave them pictures, text messages, and even proof of trips he took with us. Eventually, we cut off all contact. A year later, his wife reached out to my mom again, saying she finally wanted the truth. My mom didn't respond. She had finally started healing, and so had we. The strangest part of all this is that my mom and dad found their way back to each other after years apart. They're together again now, and though I'll never forgive Lee for what he did, I'm grateful it pushed my parents back together. Still, sometimes I think about him, the man who played dad for almost 10 years, and I wonder if he ever feels guilt when he looks at his real children. I hope someday he does. Story 39. My old neighbor was one of those people everyone knew to stay away from, loud, arrogant, and completely reckless behind the wheel. He'd been a menace on the roads for years, speeding, street racing, driving with fake registration plates, without insurance, without a valid license, even tampering with the tachograph on his truck so he could drive far over the legal hours. Somehow, he always managed to avoid serious consequences. Then one night, he hit a man on a motorcycle and fled the scene. The biker didn't survive. He was eventually caught, convicted of involuntary manslaughter, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Miraculously, he avoided being charged for the dozens of other things he'd done wrong, because the police had no idea how deep it went. While he was in prison, his girlfriend stood by him. She visited him regularly, wrote letters, and waited for him. About 6 months after he got out, they got engaged. And for a while, it looked like he had genuinely changed. He got his trucking business running legitimately, worked hard, and drove more carefully. They got married, had 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy, and built what looked like a dream life. His company grew fast, becoming well-known and trusted. They built a big, beautiful house, drove luxury cars, Range Rover, Mercedes, BMW, Audi. On the surface, it was the perfect redemption story. But it turned out to be just another performance. He hadn't changed at all. He'd just gotten smarter at hiding what he was doing. His company's success wasn't from hard work. It was from smuggling. He used his fleet of trucks to move illegal goods across borders: cigarettes, alcohol, substances, anything that could turn a profit without paying import taxes. Because his company was respected and rarely checked by customs, he got away with it for years. The real kicker? He had an entirely separate family living in another town, a second house, a second wife, and another son. When people found out, the shock was indescribable. He'd managed to live 2 full lives, switching between them like clockwork. When it all came crashing down, someone joked that he was living like he was on Noah's Ark 2 of everything. And honestly, that wasn't far from the truth. Story 40. This one's about me. Not exactly a double life reveal, but more like the unraveling of a lie I built myself. When I was a teenager, I was the classic nerd. I spent most of my time playing games, studying, and hanging out with my small group of geeky friends. I was also the only Asian kid in my school, surrounded mostly by white classmates who were just as nerdy as I was. We'd spend hours talking about computers, video games, and comic books. But when I went off to university, I felt like I needed to reinvent myself. The internet was still new back then, and online chat rooms had just become popular, but in person I was shy and socially awkward. My housemates were the opposite. Outgoing, party-loving types who dragged me to clubs while I quietly wished I were home gaming. When I came home for the holidays, though, I told a completely different story. I bragged to my old friends that I was some kind of party animal at university, constantly drinking, sleeping around, and living the crazy student life. It was harmless at first, just exaggerations for fun, but over time the stories grew and took on a life of their own. By the time I graduated, I had somehow built a reputation in my hometown as this legendary ladies' man. Years later, I got married, and my wife started asking me strange questions about my university days. Things like, how many girls did you date? Or, who was that girl you got pregnant? I laughed it off until I realized she wasn't joking. Someone had told her all those old made-up stories I used to tell. She thought I'd been some kind of wild heartbreaker. I ended up taking her to meet one of my old university friends, who confirmed that I was actually the most timid, bookish guy on campus.